Long, long ago, there was a very fierce king called Bark. People said that the reason he was so fierce was because he had a complex about being so ugly. Certainly, his ugliness was spectacular. His massive red nose hung like a huge ripe plum over bulbous, slobbering lips. His only daughter, Camelarilla, was even worse, for sandwiched between her pendulous proboscis, obviously inherited from her father, and the mouth of a pike, was a line of bristly hairs. Her ferret-like eyes shone like tiny rubies, set in flesh like soft dough, fringed with a ginger frizz. None of this was the fault of the Queen Agnes, a willowy blonde beauty, whose genteel genes had clearly been overwhelmed by Bark's aggressive ones. There was nothing aggressive about Agnes. She was mild and dumb. At the court was a very cheeky jester called Blimp. One day he decided to be extra daring, and in front of the court he recited this poem. Princess Camelarilla, the king's little girl, looks as fair as a shiny pearl, but if she were flatter and a little moister, she'd look more like an oyster. This poem was obviously not very funny, as well as not scanning. Of course no one laughed, except for the jester's feeble attempts to laugh it off. Except for one knight. He was called Sir Ronald. He was new at court, and anyway he had no sense of humour. He giggled in high falsetto. Then, to confirm his idiocy, there was a deathly hush. Ha, ha, intoned King Bark, in a theatrically sarcastic tone. His face darkened, and his Victoria Plum nose turned damson. In a voice of gravelly menace, King Bark passed sentence. Since the jester Blimp and the knight Sir Ronald find the appearance of the royal princess Camelarilla so amusing, then I shall set them a task. The first one of them that brings me a pair of dragon's eyes will have the honour and pleasure of marrying into my family. The other man will be executed. This plunged Blimp and Sir Ronald into immediate deep gloom, for both alternatives were grisly. They each weighed up whether it was worth opting for a quick execution, but Bark had already swept from the room, and all the other courtiers had turned their backs on them. There was another terrible problem. There was only one dragon left in the whole of the kingdom, and that dragon was exceedingly strong, clever, experienced, and uncharitable. All visitors to its cave were summarily eaten. Sir Ronald, being a knight, had a fairy godmother, so he went off to ask her advice. No trouble, she said cheerily, and she fished around in her skirts for a while, and then triumphantly produced a beautiful little carved ivory box. She gave it to Ronald, saying, Now, there you are, dear. You can't lose with that box. Off you go, and be a good knight. Unfortunately, Ronald, as well as having no sense of humour, had very few brains, so instead of looking to see what was inside the box, he merely put his good luck charm into his pocket and marched off to seek the dragon, thinking himself invincible. Meanwhile, Blimp, being a jester, did not have the luxury of a fairy godmother, and so he had to consult a common or garden wizard called Grom. Grom had not been consulted for years, let alone on a matter as serious as killing a dragon. Well, he asked, tugging his beard apprehensively, how do you expect me to help? Give me things to kill the dragon with, Blimp said impatiently. Ah. Grom was relieved to hear that it didn't involve him accompanying Blimp. So? Blimp spread his hands. "I can pay." "Ah." Grom thought that a mysterious tone would help at this juncture. Blimp looked unimpressed. Grom tried the inspirational next. "Aha!" He cast his eyes desperately around the piles of junk he had accumulated over the years. "There!" He pointed to some random objects. The Jester viewed the pile with sour scepticism. "What are these things?" "A lamp, curtain rail, a bucket, and a bazooka." Grom was aware that it was hard to sell these items as dragon killers, but he needed to go through the processes. "What will they do?" Blimp sounded hopeless. "They're all magic. Just have faith and they will help you to kill the dragon." Yeah. Blimp knew a lot of stupid, credulous people, but he hated being taken for one himself. But he had no other ideas, so he might as well try this rubbish. He paid up, and with a heavy heart set off for the dragon's lair. He was just in time to see his rival, Sir Ronald, make the elementary mistake of overestimating his magic protection. Sir Ronald merely walked up to where the dragon lay watching him curiously with one eye shut and said, "You can't hurt me, I've got a magic box," and drew his sword. One remarkably swift moment later there was a fluttering of vast green wings, and Sir Ronald was lying imprisoned under a huge claw. Blimp sighed fatalistically and approached the dragon, waving his lamp in front of him. More than anything, he felt embarrassed. The dragon, wondering idly if the whole world was going mad, blew a speculative cloud of hot brimstone out of his left nostril at the absurd figure. Blimp howled with pain, dropped the useless lamp, ran back a few yards, and took out his curtain rail. He muttered, "Have faith," before advancing and waving the curtain rail in the direction of the dragon. The dragon, now getting bored of this joke, blew out a jet of flames, setting fire to Blimp's coloured trousers. But the result was the same. Blimp retreated and began to wave the bucket. The dragon, now extremely bored, blew both fire and brimstone at the Jester, who retreated quickly this time, as if he'd lost faith in the magic properties of the items he'd purchased. It was true. Blimp felt he'd been seriously ripped off by Grom, and in his mind he started to compose a letter demanding his money back. The dragon, meanwhile, had returned to thinking about recipes for Sir Ronald. Blimp had no idea what a bazooka was. He'd heard of a bouzouki, and this didn't look like it played tunes. He hefted it to his shoulder, pressed some button, and hoped for a bit of magic. The missile roared away straight for the dragon. The dragon had just time to think, "Oh, shh," before the missile blew him into a maelstrom of gory pieces. Remarkably, Sir Ronald was unhurt, and Blimp was able to lever the dragon's claw off him and help him to his feet. Even more remarkably, the bazooka had left the dragon's eyes intact, so Blimp was able to scoop them into a bag he'd brought along just in case. Sir Ronald was awfully grateful to Blimp for rescuing him from the dragon, and he was very gracious, saying that the better man had won. He agreed to accompany Blimp back to court, even though he was going to his execution. It was a decent thing to do. He even commiserated with Blimp's marriage prospects. But as Blimp approached the throne to present the dragon's eyes to King Bark, Sir Ronald at last thought to look inside the ivory box that he'd been given by his fairy godmother. Inside were, yes, you guessed it, a pair of dragon's eyes. "I say," he murmured, and then charged after Blimp. "I say, you chaps, look's what I've got." Faced simultaneously with two pairs of dragon's eyes, King Bark was nonplussed, then perturbed. He began fiercely chewing his drooping nose, which over the years had become quite poisonous. He keeled over without another word, dead. This enabled a happy ending. Sir Ronald married the beautiful, brainless Queen Agnes, knowing he'd found a soulmate, and Blimp did not marry Princess Camarilla, but was relieved to leave the country on a comedy show world tour.